There's something you've probably stopped trying to explain, a kind of quiet that settled in over the last decade or so. Not a dramatic emptiness, but a thinning. Fewer people in the church pew next to you, a neighborhood where the doors stay closed, conversations that used to go somewhere and now don't. You've probably filed it under getting older. Hannah Arendt would tell you to file it somewhere else entirely, because what you're feeling has a name. And that name is not depression, not nostalgia, not a failure of social skills. Arendt gave it a name in 1951, in a book about something most people would never connect to their own living room. And in 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States issued an emergency advisory using a different vocabulary to describe the same thing. Neither group knew they were talking to each other. This video is going to show you what they were both pointing at and why the answer to it is not what you've been told. In May of 2023, Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General, released an advisory called Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. The language was medical. The findings were stark. Approximately half of American adults reported measurable levels of loneliness. The health effects, he said, were comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. He called it a public health crisis. The coverage was wide. The response was a mixture of recognition. Yes, this is real. And the usual prescription. Get out more, join a club, call a friend, put the phone down. Good advice. Not wrong. But it didn't explain why half the country was in this condition at the same time, or what it meant for something larger than individual health. For that, you need a different kind of thinker. And you need to go back 72 years. Hannah Arendt published The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, the same year she became an American citizen. She had arrived in this country a decade earlier with almost nothing. No job, limited English, stateless after fleeing Nazi Germany and then escaping a French internment camp. She wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism not from the comfort of an academic position, but from the inside of the experience she was trying to understand. What does it feel like when the political world you were born into collapses, when you have no country, no legal status, no place in the world that acknowledges your existence? That biographical fact matters because the book's final chapter, the one almost nobody reads when they pick up Arendt for the first time, is about loneliness. Not as an aside, not as a footnote to the political argument, as the foundation of it. The chapter is called Loneliness and Totalitarian Rule. And what Arendt argues there is not what you might expect. Here's the popular assumption, and it's wrong, that loneliness is primarily a psychological condition, that it's about sadness or social awkwardness, or the failure to maintain relationships, that the fix is personal, more connection, more openness, more effort. Arendt would not dispute that lonely people suffer, but she was interested in something else. She was interested in what loneliness does, not to your mood, but to your mind, and specifically to your capacity to participate in a shared world. She begins by separating three things that we tend to collapse into one word. Solitude is not loneliness. Solitude is the productive aloneness in which you keep yourself company, the condition of the thinker who withdraws from the public world not because the world has rejected her, but because she needs quiet in order to think. Solitude is a choice. And in solitude, you are not truly alone. You are in dialogue with yourself, with ideas, with the inner conversation that has always been the basis of genuine thinking. Arendt valued solitude. She practiced it. Isolation is different. Isolation is what the craftsman experiences. The scientist in the lab, the artist in the studio, who withdraws from political life in order to focus on making something. The isolated person has lost the political realm, the space of action with others, but they have kept something. The reality of the world of objects and ideas they're working on. They're still in contact with something real. Loneliness is neither of those things. Loneliness for Arendt is the experience of abandonment, not just by people, but by the world itself. The lonely person has lost what she calls common sense. The sense that there is a shared, real world out there, one that you and I both inhabit, one that we can point to and say, yes, that's how it is. When you lose common sense, you lose your grip on reality as something held in common. And here is what makes this a political argument, not a therapeutic one. Common sense is not just a feeling. It is the foundation of political judgment. It is what allows you to distinguish between a genuine argument and a piece of propaganda, between an institution that is working and one that is being hollowed out, between a shared reality and a manufactured one. When you're lonely in Arendt's sense, when you've lost the common world, you become susceptible to something specific. You become susceptible to what she calls ideological thinking, the closed logical system that offers a substitute for reality. It has an inner consistency. It explains everything. It gives you a place. And it requires, above all, that you stop checking it against the world, because the world, which might contradict it, is exactly what you've lost access to. In The Human Condition, published 7 years later, Arendt offered a metaphor that is worth sitting with. Imagine a table, she said, around which people are sitting. The table separates them. Each person is distinct, has a different angle of view, sees the room slightly differently. But the table also relates them. They are all sitting around the same object, in the same room, sharing the same meal. The table is what makes them both separate and connected. Now remove the table. What happens? The people don't become more intimate. They collapse into each other, or they fly apart. There is nothing to be gathered around. There is no shared world to orient them. That table, for Arendt, is what the common world does. The institutions, the associations, the public spaces, the shared practices of civic life, the bowling league, the church basement meeting, the town council, the union hall. These are not just ways of being social. They are the table. They are what makes it possible for people with genuinely different views to share a reality. When the table disappears, something specific happens. People lose the capacity to orient themselves in relation to each other and in relation to reality itself. They become, in Arendt's word, superfluous, not needed, not placed, not part of the common fabric. And superfluousness is the fertile ground for the totalitarian temptation which always promises, above everything else, to give you back a place. A movement to belong to. A story that explains who you are and who your enemies are. She is not talking about Germany in the 1930s as a curiosity of history. She is describing a mechanism now. If you want to go further into what Arendt actually said, not my reading of it, but her own words, with a plain English translation of each one, the link in the description takes you to a 60-page PDF called Dark Times, a quote swipe file with commentary. It's 50 of Arendt's most powerful passages, each one with a 100-word commentary explaining what she meant and why it matters now. Loneliness is one section. Forgiveness is another. Action, freedom, legacy. It's organized by theme. It's the kind of thing you keep on your desk and return to, not just read once. Now, in 1958, the political scientist Robert Putnam was a teenager. He would spend the next 40 years documenting something that Arendt had predicted would happen. His book, Bowling Alone, published in 2000, tracked the collapse of what he called civic associational life in America. The Lions clubs, the PTAs, the bowling leagues, the union locals, the neighborhood associations, the volunteer fire departments, the church committees. All of it had been in steady decline since roughly the mid-1960s. The numbers were specific and hard to argue with. Americans were joining fewer things, attending fewer meetings, knowing fewer of their neighbors, participating less in the institutions of shared public life. Putnam framed it as a social capital problem. Arendt's vocabulary was different, but her logic explains what Putnam documented. The table was being removed. Slowly, steadily, over decades, the intermediate structures that constitute the common world, the places where people with genuinely different views nonetheless showed up in the same room around the same shared project, were hollowing out. Putnam didn't cite Arendt. Arendt had been dead for 25 years when his book came out. But the connection is not forced, it is structural. What Putnam called social capital collapse, Arendt would call the dissolution of the common world. And what follows from that dissolution, in her analysis, is exactly what follows from Putnam's data. A population that is more susceptible to polarization, more susceptible to conspiratorial thinking, more susceptible to movements that offer narrative certainty in place of shared reality. This is not a partisan observation. Arendt was extraordinarily careful on this point. The susceptibility to ideology that follows from loneliness and rootlessness is not a property of one political camp. It is a human vulnerability that any ideology, on any side, can exploit in people who have lost the common world. Arendt's analysis discomforts everyone. That's part of why it's still true. And this brings us to the thing most people get wrong about their own situation. You've been asking the right question, but slightly off-center. The question most of us are asking, when we look at the political culture of the last decade or so, goes something like this. Why is everything so fragile? Why can't people agree on basic facts anymore? Why has the conversation become so closed, so certain, so immune to evidence? And the natural temptation, the one the pundits offer and the pastors and the op-ed writers, is to locate the cause in the conversation itself. In social media, in bad actors, in the breakdown of journalism, in the algorithms that feed us what we want to hear. Those are real. But Arendt would ask you to look one step earlier. The conversation didn't break down, and then people became lonely. People became lonely over decades as the table was removed, and then the conversation broke down. The susceptibility to ideology, to closed systems of explanation, to movements that replace reality with narrative. These are not the cause of the problem. They are symptoms of a population that has lost common sense in Arendt-specific meaning, the felt sense of a shared, real world that anchors judgment. She wrote this in 1951. The full sentence from the final chapter of The Origins of Totalitarianism reads, "What prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century." Read that again. She wrote it in 1951. She said loneliness had moved from the margins, from old age, from exile, from the fringes of society, to the center of mass experience. And she said this move was what prepared people, not for sadness, but for domination. The Surgeon General confirmed the epidemic in 2023. Putnam documented the mechanism in 2000. Arendt named the political consequence in 1951. 3 different authorities, 3 different decades, 3 different vocabularies, pointing at the same thing. So what does Arendt say you do about it? Not therapy, not self-help, not social media detox, though none of those are wrong. She would say the antidote to loneliness, in her sense, the political sense, is action in the specific meaning she gives that word in the human condition. Showing up in a shared world, with people who see things differently than you do, around a project that matters to both of you. Not just in your family, not just among people who agree with you, in public. In the spaces where plurality is real, where the table still exists or can be rebuilt. This is why the bowling league mattered. Not because bowling is important, because bowling leagues put you in a room with your neighbor who votes differently and your coworker who believes differently, around a shared game in a shared space. The conversation you had before and after the game, that was the political education. That was common sense being maintained. Arendt is not telling you to go bowling. She is telling you something more demanding, that the antidote to the political crisis you are watching is not a better argument, not a better candidate, not a better explanation. It is the recovery of the common world, the rebuilding of the table, in whatever form is available to you, in whatever community you inhabit. That might be a church that is genuinely open to difficult conversation, not just a gathering of the like-minded. It might be a neighborhood association. It might be a town hall meeting you've never attended. It might be showing up somewhere you're not sure you'll be comfortable. Because comfort, in the absence of plurality, is a warning sign, not a destination. She would say, the second half of life is exactly the right time to do this. Because you have something the young don't have yet. You have the experience of having actually built something, a family, a community, a set of institutions that showed you what the common world feels like when it's working. You know what the table is supposed to look like. That knowledge is not nostalgia. It's a map. Alexis de Tocqueville, writing about American democracy in the 1830s, warned that the greatest threat to self-government was not tyranny from above, but what he called soft despotism. The quiet withdrawal of citizens into their private circles, away from public life, leaving the administration of common affairs to a distant, centralized power that they neither influenced nor resisted. He called it soft because it didn't look like chains, it felt like comfort. It felt like the reasonable decision of people who were tired and busy and not sure their participation would matter anyway. Tocqueville's America avoided that fate for a while because of exactly the institutions Putnam documented falling apart. The voluntary associations, the local civic bodies, the 10,000 ways Americans found to gather in public around shared purposes. Arendt, who knew her Tocqueville, would say those institutions were not just civic conveniences. They were the condition of political freedom. They were the table. The question that remains after this video, the one I don't want to answer for you because it shouldn't be answered in general, is this. What is the table in your life right now? What is left of it? And what would it cost you to help build it back? That is a smaller question than the ones we usually ask about the state of the country. It is also a harder one, because it has an answer, and the answer requires something from you. Tell me this: is there one place, a church, a club, a neighborhood, a conversation that used to feel like the common world to you and doesn't anymore? I want to know what it was. Dark times call for clear minds,